Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our STARC Spring Symposium. If you don't know what STARC is the Society of Trojan Archaeologists. You don't have to be an archaeology major to be a part of our society. It's just for anyone who has an interest in archaeology or anything archaeologically related things. Also, I want to thank everyone who's here from ANTH 202. Get your extra credit. I'm here for it. Okay, basically, I think we have, we have 4 people presenting today, and I don't know if anyone wants to jump in at the end and just talk about what you're writing your ANTH 202 final on. You could do that too if you want to brag. But we're gonna start off with 4 presentations. Sean, do you want to MC?
Introduce yours.
Sure.
So Anna is a junior majoring in archaeology and minoring in folklore and popular culture. And she's also co-president of STARC with me. And when she's not practicing historical embroidery techniques or reading up on international mythology, you can find her building escape rooms or painting fun things on her nails. So today, she'll be presenting on female structure undergarments through a historical and contemporary lens.
Yes. Okay. So you might be thinking, wow, Anna, that sounds really niche and weird and not something that a lot of people talk about all the time. And you would be right. Last semester, I took RIT 340 and I took a social sciences section, meaning that we had to conduct our own studies. And we had to pick a guiding question / topic for the semester. And I picked female structural undergarments because through an archaeological lens, I feel like garment as artifact is something that's really important. It allows you to learn about daily life, and it's specifically in terms of female structural undergarments, that is something that you don't see, you're going about your day, someone sees your undergarments, but they reveal a lot about the needs and daily lives of the people wearing them. So something important to think about. Additionally, what is this there? There has been a really weird resurgence of some historical trends in contemporary fashion throughout the pandemic. So for one of the things I wrote for this class, I went onto Shein, which is a fast fashion retailer that literally releases new items of clothing every single day. And this was last semester, so I don't know what the number is now. It's probably higher, but there were 1,200 results for the word corset on Shein. And they weren't necessarily real corsetry, but things that have laces and eyelets and lace up, and these were a couple of the vibes. Oh, do you want me to turn the lights down?
Yeah, I got it.
Cool. Thank you, Jillian. There's some black ones, but this one, it's kind of hard to tell. It has a Rococo painting on it. So there was this kind of need for escapism. This is kind of for those of you that know what cottagecore is, there was this need to dress you're frolicking in a field all the time, and along with that came this weird I'm a medieval Renaissance princess because it's a pandemic and life sucks and I just want to escape. So that was what inspired me to start looking into this specifically during the pandemic, because it was just everywhere contemporarily. And so because of that, I wanted to talk about how maybe the mindset surrounding corsets may have changed. So I asked people in my survey, what are the adjectives that come to mind when you think of a corset? And according to this word cloud, the biggest one was tight. Because if you think about what corseting is, it's you're lacing yourself into a very boned garment to try and make a specific shape with your body. But there were some really interesting additions that I didn't expect, as in beautiful, and mostly just beautiful fashion, Halloween, fancy. There were some not so negative adjectives in this survey, which I found super interesting because people are starting to learn more about corsetry as a thing versus just as an idea or a concept. But still the biggest ones were tight, uncomfortable, structured, trying to force yourself into something that isn't shaped how a body's supposed to be shaped. So I asked people what they thought the function of a corset was, and most people believed that they were used to achieve an ideal thin body type by like forcing yourself into something uncomfortable. However, a couple of respondents did say that they were just an old-fashioned version of like a modern like bra, basically. In actuality, corsetry is a very interesting aspect of historical costuming, in that they were mostly used just like as a bra. They were also used to support layers of heavy clothing. So if you imagine all of the skirts and bodices that people were wearing to like be socially acceptable, having something super structured around your stomach helps like distribute the weight properly. Also, if you were a laborer, you might think like, oh no, if I'm gonna be lifting heavy things all day, I don't want to be wearing something restrictive. It actually helps you distribute weight properly. So if you like are holding something heavy, hold it up against your corset, and your corset can handle most of that weight. They also help you keep up with stylish silhouettes without having to physically modify your body. So I wrote here, Victorian padding equals the BBL of today. So a lot less invasive if you're trying to like emulate an ideal body structure. I've also heard a really interesting take from someone, a modern day person who worked at Colonial Williamsburg, who dressed authentically every single day, or at least 5 days a week. And she said that there was almost something kind of empowering about people not knowing what your real body looks like. If you're wearing some kind of set of stays or corset underneath your like outfit, and then your outfit itself is creating a really outrageous silhouette, people have no idea what you look like. And there's something very cool about that. So as a part of my survey, I presented the people who participated with 6 garments, 3 more historical and 3 more contemporary. So the first being a early 1800s Regency set of short stays. So if you've seen Bridgerton, this is what they would wear. It doesn't really go all the way down your stomach because the way their dresses work is it's like an empire waist. So it's only form fitting to here, and the rest is like a tube. So you don't need to like be compressed like in your stomach area. This 1890s black cotton corset, which is just like really cool. A 1950s girdle, which is like the transition between a corset and like a bra during like the introduction of, I guess, like stretchier fabrics, spandex specifically. We have a regular bra. We have this corset off of Amazon, which I have seen all over TikTok. And so I wanted to include it. And then modern shapewear like Spanx. So, which is kind of like the modern day corset when it comes to like changing your body. I asked people to rank them on how restrictive they thought they were. All of these pieces were. Had some interesting results. The most restrictive was the Amazon corset. I'm assuming because it's showing this like insane hourglass shape. The next being the black cotton corset, it's very long. That makes sense. Then being the girdle, it also covers a lot of skin. Then being Spanx, covers a lot of skin. Short stays covers a little less skin, and the modern underwire bra covers the least amount of skin. So that made a lot of sense to me. But what was really funny was when I asked participants which ones they would be most likely to wear. Number 1 was Spanx, and number 2 was the underwire bra. Makes sense. But then the third was the black cotton corset, which ranked second most restrictive. And the explanations for the responses was because it looked cool. And so, like, I think one of the responses was like, it looks hot as hell. I was like, that's fun. So that kind of indicated to me that when it comes to corsets, people don't care as much anymore about the physicality and how they make you feel, but how cool they are, I guess. There's this, it's like that aesthetic resurgence of this historical thing that is now being considered like a trend. And I think that's it. Any questions? Hello. It's
First
cool.
off, amazing job.
Yeah.
Any questions?
It's a pretty niche topic, but I'm happy to discuss more about it if anyone is interested. I know that I think offered in the spring semesters, the theater department offers an intro to corset construction class. So if you're interested in learning more about this type of stuff, like hands-on, that's a cool option. But yeah, shall we move on?
Sure, thank you so much. I can go next.
Cool.
All right, so next is Lauren, who is currently VP at STARC and will be president soon. She is a double major in archaeology and Italian. She's been on excavations in various parts of Spain and also Pompeii. She'll be excavating on the Agora this summer in Athens. And she's part of 2 research projects in the archaeology research lab we have on campus. The first is the Hotel Al Judaida publication project, in which she's working as a student researcher to analyze artifacts and database work. And second, she is part of the National Endowment of the Humanities Book of Hours virtual reality project, where she's doing experimental archaeology with ink and parchment in order to better understand the ways in which the Book of Hours has aged over time. And that is the subject of this presentation.
Yes. So hello, everyone. I'm Lauren. And today I'll be talking about some of my preliminary experimental archaeology work regarding making ink. So as Sean just said, I'm part of the National Endowment of the Humanities Book of Hours virtual reality project. And I was onboarded in order to do Photoshop work. However, in doing that Photoshop work, we realized we needed more context. And so then I moved to experimental archaeology in order to get that context. Just to begin, so I guess why? Well, I already gave the reasoning behind the context. So the Book of Hours itself, our Book of Hours is very unique, very beautiful. This is one of the pages of our Book of Hours. And in creating this virtual reality experience, we're really trying to give the experience that you're in person with our Book of Hours. You can turn pages, there's music, there's translation from Latin to English, Latin to Spanish, etc. So it's a really immersive experience. However, to make it more immersive, we really wanted to emulate the way that time has taken its toll on this very old book, which is why we were creating the virtual reality experience in order to preserve it as it continues to sadly deteriorate, regardless of preservation. While we look at our book, you can kind of see that there's various smudging around the corners, just in various parts here. When you actually look up close to the book, there's quite a bit of smudging on it. And so I was told to emulate this smudging in order to create a different aspect in our virtual reality experience, where if you touch the book in certain spots, you create a smudge. However, the smudges were starting to turn out not very realistic, considering the various tools on Photoshop, and we really didn't know what we were going for. We didn't know how things smudge in terms of ink and parchment. So I decided to begin experimental archaeology to make ink and experiment with it in order to understand why our book looks the way it does and the evolution of how we make books, write, and etc. Also, why? Well, why not? Oh, my bad. Thank you. So to discuss my progress, last semester I did my preliminary research in which I really looked into ink making, what kinds of inks they used during when our Book of Hours was being used, how printing paper goes during that time. For reference, our book is from the Renaissance, quite a large period of time, but we can sort of gather information on book making and specifically Book of Hour making during this time period. I also looked into parchment making to see what kind of type of parchment our book is made out of, whether that be from goat skin, sheep skin, calf skin, etc. And with having gathered my parchment, realizing it's probably more sheep or calf, I have those parchments, but then I needed to make the ink. So after I had done my ink research, this semester I was going on the journey to make ink and then test everything. So just to show you what that looks like. Oh, also, that's our cover of the book. She's quite old, but so for the ink making process, the ink that's used in the book is an oak gall ink. I know you're thinking, what is oak gall? Well, I'll tell you. Essentially, oak gall forms on trees when you have certain insects, specifically wasps usually, that will go and lay their eggs, and there's this little cocoon shaped situation that forms, and then eventually the larva will eat their way out of it, and you're left with this bulb that kind of looks like around that. And as with time, you can collect those and then dry them out, and then those are crushed and then used as the base for the ink. So right here we have Bridget crushing the oak gall because I needed a picture and I couldn't really take a picture of myself while hammering oak gall. This was actually the hardest process because we didn't have a mortar and pestle in the lab on the day that I was working on this, which I thought we did. So I got creative, just the experimental archaeology process. And I was quite literally hammering the oak gall on the floor of the lab. And we're on the second or the third floor. So, downstairs was probably like, what is going on? But it worked. And so then the next step is to soak the crushed oak gall after you've obviously measured it out and got the proportions correctly. And so here I have it soaking for 24 hours. And then after that, after those 24 hours, you come back in, you measure out ferrous sulfate and gum arabic. So the ferrous sulfate creates this reaction that's very color changing. I didn't think it would be immediate. However, right when I poured it in, this like brownish liquid after strained, it was kind of like a little bit darker than what you see here. This brownish liquid turned like instantaneously black in the spots where the ferrous sulfate had met the water. So it's quite cool. And then the gum arabic is used essentially to thicken it up and allow it to stay on the pages. So that's the process of making ink one way. Obviously, there are very many different techniques. There was one with boiling water. There was one that was an instant ink recipe. That recipe, however, was from centuries ago, and it doesn't really have measurements. So we didn't go with that one. But if you're interested in that recipe, do Dr. Lynn Dodd's Maymester, and you'll get to do the instant ink recipe, which is pretty fun. Anyways, so this is what the ink looked like right after I had mixed everything in, very murky. It was rather clear, you could see the reflection of everything. So sorry for the bad quality picture, because you could just really see the ceiling through everything. But to continue on, so what's next? So this week and next week specifically, I'll be wrapping up this experiment for the semester, and I'll obviously continue next semester. So I actually have my quills made. Essentially just you take feathers and you cut off the little pointy part at the end of the feather in a specific diagonal format. So you get this kind of calligraphy writing pen of the Renaissance, otherwise known as a quill. And I have my parchment. However, first we'll be writing on just regular loose leaf paper so as not to damage the parchment, because parchment is expensive. And yeah, don't want to ruin that. But once, we get the hang of writing on paper and making sure that the ink is all right to use on the parchment, we'll transfer and start writing on parchment. And then from there, I'll get to do fun stuff where I'll just put parchment in random parts of kitchens and the lab. So I'll be leaving a few in sunlight, putting a few in the oven just to simulate gradual heat over time. Like if you left something in under a magnifying glass with the sun projecting down on it. And that would happen because many times, many people who use these book of hours would have magnifying glasses of sorts to be looking at the text. I'll also be applying cold. By that, I mean just sticking it in the freezer and also the fridge. And so with that, I'll sort of be able to see what different climates, temperatures, conditions in general affect the parchment and how you can create smudging in these various types of situations. There was also a suggestion by my supervisor to, eat burgers and then just start writing with our greasy hands to see, if that creates any smudging, which I'm sure it would, but if anyone would like to partake in that experiment, let me know. Burgers on house. And with that, that's kind of where I'm at, and thank you for listening. Any questions?
I mean, I don't know, in general, if y'all haven't taken a visit to the archaeology lab to do anything involving our Oculus headsets, make some time to go. We have a bunch of faculty and also, of course, student lab workers who have done a lot of really cool VR stuff.
Yeah, and if you come in, I'll be able to show you how the Oculus works with the VR experience. Most of it's already set up. Obviously, there's some fine tuning that still needs to be done, but we're already into phase 2 of the project. So phase 1 was essentially completing the preliminary VR experience. So you can go in, you can make the smudges with my bad inaccurate smudges that we are working on fixing. And you can take a look around. And yeah, the church is in Belgium too. So if you want to be virtual reality in Belgium, Sabrina.
I don't know if I missed this, but what is the book of hours and what is their historical significance?
Wonderful question. So a book of hours is essentially a religious observatory text. So it's not quite the Bible, but it's not quite a prayer book. It's kind of like an in-between where you have scripture, you have morals in there, and it's essentially a religious text that's not as official as the Bible, but not as loose as like a prayer book, if that makes any sense. These were heavily used during the Renaissance and stuff like that. And if any of the other archaeologists or historians in the room want to jump in, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, it's called a book of hours because it'll tell you like at what hour to say different prayers, you know, so that's where the name comes from.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think gasped women were allowed to use them.
Yeah.
Ooh. Yeah.
You're correct. Awesome. Any other questions or should we move on?
We'll move on, but thank you, Lauren, for that lovely little sneak peek. Okay.
Jillian Sawyer is a junior studying archaeology and linguistics. She's been also working at the Archaeology Research Center since the fall of 2020, and she has social media for STARC. Her primary research interests are endangered language revitalization and community-based archaeology. In her free time, she likes going rock climbing, weightlifting, and pretty much anything outdoorsy, which is in line for a lot of archaeologists. Today, she'll be presenting on the Apulian pottery she's been working on in the lab.
Yeah. So I was going to set up. Yes. So I'll be presenting on a research provenance project that I've been doing in the lab since about August or September of last semester. It's about Apulian red figure pottery shards, and I will get into what those are. So you can switch to the next slide. Okay, so what is Apulian pottery? A little bit of a history about it. Apulian pottery is a Italic pottery tradition, really influenced by Greek colonies during the 3rd and 4th century BC. Yeah, so it's kind of the syncretic tradition of the indigenous Italic peoples and the Greek colonial workshops that went and were creating Attic pottery, which is a very famous Greek pottery tradition. Yeah, so it kind of blended the historical Italian tradition of the specific region with the Greek tradition to create a unique kind of identity of Apulian specific pottery. So what's kind of interesting about the artists of it is we don't know any specific names or any specific workshops where they came from. It's all kind of identified by specific pieces that they created. So for one example, the White Sakos painter is a very famous Apulian painter, and he's identified in that way because his most famous piece is in White Sakos, which I believe is somewhere in England. Don't count me on that. That's just a guess. But so Apulian pottery doesn't really have a lot of information in general about sites that it came from. It suffered a lot of grave robbing. A lot of the pieces, a lot of the vessels are funerary objects. So yeah, a lot of the stuff has been put on the black market, and donors just kind of buy it off the black market, and then eventually it ends up in collections like the Arc Lab or in museums, and we don't know how they got it or the site that it came from, and that is specifically an issue that the pieces that I'm working with suffer from. Go to the next slide. Oh, this is also very quickly a map of the Apulian region. The big center of Apulian pottery, specifically Apulian red figure pottery, which I'll be talking about, is Toronto, and we'll also be focusing here at Canossa. So remember this distance. Yes. So a few different types of vessels. These are kind of the main ones that I'll be talking about in the red figure tradition. So a little background: Apulian pottery, or Apulian red figure pottery, is called red figure because the figures are red. Also, very similar to Greek red figure pottery. So just some examples: we have plates, you have volute craters, hydras up at the top. This is a canossa, I believe, an amphora, skyphus, and a bell crater all the way at the bottom. Yeah, so that's just some different types, just kind of an examples. These are not ones in our collection, but these are ones that exist. So the Arc Lab collection specifically, this is a vessel that we have. It's pretty cool. It's pretty large. It's yay big. So craters is the pieces that we have specifically volute craters. So volute craters were traditionally used originally to mix water and wine together, and eventually they stopped making them with bottoms and just used them as funerary pieces. They were like used as grave markers or buried as grave goods. And they were just these like massive vessels that kind of function as like tombstones in some cases. So in our collection, we mostly have pieces by the Baltimore painter, which is supposed by past research. And that is part of what I'm doing during my research is decoding whether the Baltimore painter actually created all of the pieces in our collection. So the kind of motifs that the Baltimore painter has that I identify him is the Niscos stela motif. So you see kind of right here, these edges, this is the edges of a stela where you see white figures inside that's representing the dead. And on the opposite end, you'll see a kind of similar rectangular structure with a column in the middle. That is the Niscos. So oftentimes these pieces are depicting scenes of like the underworld and the gods. You'll often see at the very top, like the head of Athena or other Greek deities sprouting out of flowers. Yeah, so you're seeing like funerary pieces in the middle. You'll also see like fight scenes or sometimes like daily activities, wars, myth retellings. They're very expressive pieces. Yes, so the main center of Apulian pottery, red figure pottery, was in Toronto, which was like here on the map, but the Baltimore painter came from Kenosha, from what we understand about analysis of his pottery, which was quite a distance away. And you kind of see that also specifically in like the clay that's used, and the different motifs and different like things depicted on the pieces. Yes, so there are two kind of main types of red figure pottery. There's ornate and then plain. Ornate is you're going to see pieces like this that have multiple figures, multiple different things being depicted, and then simple would just be like a face. And just a tiny like little bit of background, our pieces were donated by Steve Rubinger, which is a very rich man who just gave us a ton of stuff and gave us no information about it. So yes. Yeah, so my research so far has kind of been focused on trying to understand the provenance of these pieces. This is another piece in our collection. To try to understand how we got them and how they, whose hands they went through Rubinger and even before then, which is information that is not necessarily readily available. I did email Steve Rubinger and he ghosted me. So yeah, so we don't really know. So to make up for that, the other part of my research has been focused on trying to find out the workshops where specifically these pieces came from. So that's been a little bit focused on looking at clay composition. We see in our collection two distinct clay colors. One is like a lighter like tan color and one is a very deep dark orange, indicating a different chemical composition. One of those is higher in calcium and one is higher in iron. That's relevant, but they come from very different places. So that's also kind of an indication that these might not all be from the same painter or from the same workshop. And we might have a much more diverse collection than we have assumed for the past 20 years of owning these pieces. So in our collection, we also see at least 7 different vessels. So 7 different pieces that would be yay big or yay bigger. If we had all of them, a lot of it is just kind of sherds like this. You see a lot of like fragmentation. We'll have pieces that are like this big or pieces that are like this big. But yeah, so at least 7 different vessels and very likely upwards of 20 represented in our entire collection. So we have, I think, of pieces that are not assembled, there's like 250 plus. There's so many of these. Yeah, I guess you go to the next slide. Yes, so next step of this research, this is all like preliminary stuff. That's all I've done so far with the collection. Next steps, we'll be doing XRF research, which will be chemical analysis, specifically of the like sherds that we have, the pottery, to try to find out if we can match it to specific clay beds in Italy, in Puglia, to get a little bit more information on like where exactly did these pieces come from, who might have made them, how were they made, when exactly were they made. So there's that. And then I had something else here, but I don't know what it was. Maybe reach out to Steve Rippinger again and we'll see what he says. But yeah, so that's my research so far.
Any questions for Jillian? Cool. I mean, we've had already 2 presentations about really cool things that go down in the archaeology lab. So if any of this sounds appealing to you and you need some lab experience before you graduate to look really good on your resume, but you want to do something that's a little bit more outside of the box, interesting, archaeologically based, go to the Arc Lab. Thanks, Jillian.
So I'm up next. I'm Sean. I'm a co-president of STARC with Anna, and I'm also doing cool things in the Arc Lab. I'm doing a VR experience to do with Roman baths in Tarsus, which is really exciting. And my research is all about Roman colonization in Greece and Anatolia, and also Ottoman receptions of classical archaeology. So what the Ottoman Empire thought of these ancient Roman ruins, and also what happens when you get colonial Europeans showing up and, you know, messing things around and trying to excavate and extract. So without further ado, here's my presentation about British colonial extraction of Halicarnassus marble lions. So in 1855, in his capacity as the vice consul of Mytilene in Greece, modern Greece, then the Ottoman Empire, Charles Thomas Newton spotted Hellenistic marble lions in the walls of the Budrum Castle in Ottoman Anatolia. These were from the nearby yet undiscovered ruins of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. Newton arranged to get a firman, which is an Ottoman decree, for permission to extract the marble lions and export them to the British Museum. In early 1857, months into the excavation, the firman had not yet arrived. The Ottoman Minister of War ordered the removal of the lions to Istanbul instead. The Ottomans were trying to keep the lions. But before the lions ship left for Istanbul, Newton's firman arrived with permission to take the lions. And after a heated back and forth, Newton eventually paid a hefty bribe and got permission to ship the lions off to the British Museum. I primarily analyze Newton's popular account of the incident from his book, Travels and Discoveries in the Levant. I'm doing like a meta-analysis of archaeology. How did archaeologists then do archaeology? First, I argue that the incident of the marble lions represents more than just Newton's worldview at the time. The British state threw financial and military weight behind Newton, and Newton's popular narrative anticipates the worldview of his audience, the broader British public. His narrative was one of cultural heritage ownership. Newton rhetorically connected the British with the Hellenistic Greeks and placed the British above the Ottomans in a technological hierarchy in order to justify the British ownership of the lions instead of the Ottomans. Newton's use of comedic language indicates that he expected his British audience to take a wry satisfaction in his extraction of the artifacts to the British Museum. Next, I examined the intense emotions of the conflict over heritage ownership and ascribed motivations behind the strong reactions each of the different historical actors had to the events. Finally, I will end with how the lion's colonial history is presented in the British and Istanbul museums today. Most of the lions are in the British Museum and only one of them is in the Istanbul Museum. The history of the marble lion's extraction highlights the valuation, exportation, and contestation over cultural heritage in the 19th century Ottoman Aegean. Newton's excavation of the lions and his account reflect the broader circumstances of British colonial extraction in the mid-19th century. The British state instructed him to acquire antiquities for the British Museum and gave him funds for it. They placed such an importance on excavating classical cultural heritage that they gave him substantial military backing as well, including a ship of war crewed by 150 men, which was a huge investment. This was, of course, not the only time the British used their military to acquire cultural heritage, as we see in the famous case of the Benin bronzes. Newton thus acted as a representative for the British state in his extraction of the lions, and can also act as a historical representative for British state policy. Throughout his popular account of the lion's extraction, Newton used intense emotional language to describe his reactions to the events of his excavation, language which assumes the reader's sympathy. There are no emotional words in his previous publication about the lions, which was a book intended mainly for archaeologists. This is for the general public. So these elements are thus especially included in his book with the popular audience in mind. This indicates that he assumed his audience would sympathize with his intense emotions regarding the marble lions, because if not, he would risk appearing overly melodramatic to the readers by including these strong emotional reactions. At one point, he has like an emotional breakdown on the beach. So he assumes that this looks okay, because otherwise he wouldn't put it in. You only put your best photos on the gram. Newton explicitly placed the interest of the public as a primary goal of his travelogue. So his account can illuminate the mindset of the broader audience Newton targeted with his book. Newton drew an implicit comparison between the ancient Greeks and the modern British. He describes the fine workmanship of the marble lions and Hellenistic tools, words which parallel the wonderful tools and appliances and mechanical ingenuity of the British. He uses words like wonderful and fine for both. And through this rhetoric, Newton connects British and Hellenistic civilization, a strategy that he and many other colonial authors used to justify their extraction of artifacts. They're sort of in line with this civilization tradition, therefore maybe they own it, is sort of the idea that he's getting at here. Newton contrasted British technology with the Turks, whose minds, he said, could not understand his excavation technology. At least that's the way he presents it. Newton thus establishes a hierarchy of technology with the British above the Ottomans, a strategy he used to invalidate Ottoman claims to the lions by means of their secondary technological status. The idea is they can't excavate like the British. They don't have the technology, which isn't true, but that's the way Newton presents it. By doing so, he used another long-running justification Europeans used for colonial extraction. The emotional language Newton used displays the value he placed on classical artifacts. He says the extraction of 2 of his eye teeth could not have given him so great a pang as when the Ottoman Minister of War does the counter excavation to try and get the lions to Istanbul instead of the British Museum. So the emotional language Newton used shows that he expected his readers to share in his thoughts. He feels so strongly that Britain ought to own the lions rather than the Ottomans that he likens it to being in physical pain. Why does he place so much value on the lion's extraction? This answer offers a window into the reasons colonial powers and their representatives put so much effort and resource behind extracting antiquities. The lions were part of Newton's effort to forward his career, which later paid off when he was selected as keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum. Another thing that makes the lions precious is their connection to a specific ancient artist, Scopas. He also cited marbles as a benefit of the National Collection of Sculpture and Antiquities, a purpose which paralleled the famous Elgin marbles, a public education, and also a projection of British national identity and power. See, we are able to go overseas and get all of this for the British Museum. It's a demonstration of global power and influence. All of these motivations placed a value on the marble lions, and importantly, a value on their extraction back to Britain. And the high degree of this value is evident in the emotional language Newton uses. The comic language Newton used indicates that he also intended the British reader to share in his satisfaction at successfully conducting artifact extraction. A man named Suleiman and his wife refused to sell their house to him to excavate under it. In response, Newton dug all the way around the house, leaving it an island in a sea of rubble. He purchased the house for only 20 pounds because that had destroyed its property value. And he calls the wife a stern hag and plies her husband with a little heap of gold, which is sort of a like sarcastic, ironic reference to the meager payment of 20 pounds. And he makes sure to mention that this 20 pounds dazzles the Ottoman Suleiman. Including this detail emphasizes the financial difference between Suleiman and Newton, a financial hierarchy. Newton presents this incident through a comic lens, including a derogatory quote from the Roman satirist Juvenal to describe Suleiman's wife and the image of their house surrounded by a sea of rubble, which suggests that he expected his audience to relish in the power imbalance. Newton expressed a similar satisfaction in using his financial weight to buy out the Ottoman Commandant of the Bodrum Castle. The Ottoman Commandant when Newton presents him with the firman, insisted that the firman only specified aslanlar, lions, rather than kaplanlar, leopards, and argued that those statues weren't lions, they were leopards, so this firman doesn't apply and you can't take them to the British Museum. So he's sort of trying to work with the firman there. In response, Newton bribed him to get the marbles. He playfully adds that the commandant was so touched with his generosity that he let him take a leopard's head, not specified in the firman, still referring to the animals as leopards in jest. Newton's comedic tone indicates the mentalité for colonial representatives at the time. It points to the satisfaction he took in extraction, and he expects the British reader to share in his satisfaction, to be in on the joke that he bribed his way into exporting the marble artifacts from the Ottoman Empire. The local Ottomans in Newton's account display a variety of reactions to his extraction of artifacts. Some residents demonstrate interest, keeping track of where the antiquities are, and in extreme cases, dying of exposure from watching excavations too long. Some residents saw the excavation as a chance to profit and to sell their land for more money. Some resisted, like Suleiman and his wife. Even in this biased account, it is evident that the townspeople's reactions to Newton's excavation were complex and varied based on their individual circumstances. The Ottoman Commandant stands out as a particularly important figure in the lion's extraction because he was the one who ultimately gave his approval.
My bad. Do you guys' email ever do this? Okay. 5 more minutes, Sean.
So the Ottoman Commandant stands out as a particularly important figure because he was the one who ultimately gave his approval for the lion's exportation. He was in charge of that castle the lions came from. The Commandant moved quickly to execute his orders and send the lions to Istanbul, and boasted about Newton's lack of results, demonstrating his personal desire to foil Newton's antiquities excavation. The Commandant negatively reacts to seeing the firmans authorizing the lions' export, showing that he's, again, personally invested, and he resisted the extraction in 3 different ways before he ultimately relented. He performed a counter excavation to try and get the lions for himself. He did the is it a lion, is it a leopard semantics thing to try and get around the firman. And he also contested the firman's financial arrangements to be like, the money isn't quite set up right, so I guess we'll just have to throw out the whole thing, right? So he does these 3 different forms of resistance. And only one of these was on an official order, that counter excavation. 2 of those were on his own initiative, underscoring his personal desire to resist extraction. So the question remains, why does he accept the bribe if he is personally invested in keeping the lions in the Ottoman Empire? Why was Newton ultimately successful? The Ottomans had ended the Crimean War the previous year, in which the British played a pivotal role as an ally against the Russians. Perhaps the Commandant felt a need to acquiesce to British demands in order to maintain British support for future conflicts. They were an important ally. Newton also had a ship of war parked in Bodrum's harbor. This may have acted as an implicit threat of force that the Commandant felt reluctant to test much further by continued resisting. It's a bit hard to resist when there are guns pointed at you, effectively. Finally, this incident is similar to the Commandant at the Athenian Acropolis. Another British colonial representative, Edward Daniel Clark, wrote that the Acropolis Commandant didn't like artifact extraction, but was poor and had a family to support, so bribes could convince him. If the Commandant, in this case, received a small salary like that, then it is possible that Newton offered him a large enough sum of money that he felt he could not refuse given his circumstances. Likely, it was a combination of these different factors. In the British Museum, none of the lions' object labels mention how Newton acquired the lions. They don't mention local Ottoman resistance or any details from his book. The Istanbul Archaeology Museum sort of hints at the lion's history. It says that the lion is the only piece in their collection from the Halikarnassus Mausoleum, which has been reconstructed in the British Museum. But the label in the Istanbul Museum does not detail why or how this happened, and in both museums, the objects lack their full history and context. As an extrapolation of what a recent author, Dan Hicks, writes about anthropology museums, museums like the British and Istanbul Archaeology Museums cannot live up to their, in my opinion, cannot live up to their central function of generating the awareness of universal importance of material culture and human lives and exposure to different perspectives if they do not fully confront the history of exploitative colonial extraction in their collections. Collections like the Halicarnassus marble lens.
Any questions for Sean? I mean, I don't know. I enjoyed that AP Lang rhetorical analysis sleigh. So yeah, really great job. Oxford bound man. Okay, that concludes our 4 presenters for today. In conclusion, if any of this sounded interesting to you, or if you're like, none of that sounded interesting to me, but I have other things that interest me that I would want to pursue on my own time, consider declaring an archaeology minor. They're super interdisciplinary. So like if your like major is already in the humanities, you can continue your minor in the humanities, or if your major is in the sciences, you can continue like your minor in the sciences, do like chem and like environmental science and spatial sciences courses. It's one of the easiest minors to tag on. So, and it's a lot of fun. It makes your brain like work in different ways. Or declare a major. I don't know where you guys are in your academic career. But thank you for joining. If you are in ANTH 202 and you did not sign in with Hannah, make sure you do so that you can get your extra credit. We want to make sure that you get repaid for your time here. Also grab pizza. We bought a substantial amount of it. So feel free to take a second slice if you've already had one. And anyone else have any closing remarks? Lauren, Sean, Jillian, Hannah, Bridget?
Thanks for coming. Yeah, definitely check out the art lab.
Woo! Geology school. Thanks, guys.